Whom the Gods Fear, by J. Wdowski. Chapter 3. 2 more weeks had passed, and the Marco Polo was only days from launching. The 88-member crew had all been chosen and was making their last-minute preparations aboard the vessel. The Defense Department's military attachment had arrived the day before with the ship's weapon systems, 2 double-barreled, 8th-generation magnetic rail cannon turrets, including ample munitions of 75mm iridium and depleted uranium balls. Developed in the 1990s and perfected in the early 21st century, electric-powered magnetic railguns and cannons replaced the centuries-old use of gunpowder artillery systems. They were first used on American naval vessels by the end of the first half of the 21st century. Second-generation railguns could fire projectiles at a velocity of Mach 5 with an effective range of 220 miles. In comparison, the most advanced conventional artillery piece had a range of only 6 to 13 miles. Warships no longer needed to stockpile explosive artillery shells or explosive chemical-propelled missiles with explosive warheads. It made serving on naval vessels much safer. The other great military advantage of the first railguns was they could fire aluminum pellets, making each shot from their weapon systems economically cheaper compared to firing the more expensive conventional artillery shells. Railguns, in comparison to complex high-tech early 21st century missiles, cost mere hundreds of dollars per shot as opposed to hundreds of thousands to millions of US dollars per missile fired. 10th-generation rail cannons fired in space had theoretically unlimited range, were a much larger caliber than first-generation railguns. Modern rails cannons had the advantage of a use of the rare earth mineral iridium as a projectile instead of aluminum. Robotic mining of the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter finally made iridium economically affordable as a projectile. Iridium has a density of 22.56 grams per cubic centimeter. In comparison, aluminum at only 1.72 grams per cubic centimeter. In addition to iridium's density, its hardness, paramagnetic properties, and high-temperature melting point made it ideal as a rail cannon projectile. Iridium balls gave the weapon an extremely powerful punch. For the Marco Polo's secondary weapon system, the military supplied them with 4 10th-generation crystal-based electric lasers. The CL systems were ideal for defense. They were fast as light, point-and-shoot, bottomless magazine weapons. These attributes made them perfect for knocking out inbound offensive projectiles or missiles. The CL weapon system could also be adjusted between warm and hot settings for non-lethal and lethal offensive strikes. At a warm setting, the CL could fry an opponent's electronic systems, rendering ships without protective armor dead in the water. At a bit warmer setting, they could damage an enemy ship enough to force them to back off without destroying them. At their extreme hot setting, they could vaporize small craft or burn destructive holes through a larger ship's pressurized armor hull. Glenn was still hopeful that none of these weapon systems would be necessary. After meeting with the commander of the military attachment, Glenn felt reassured that the systems were well managed and would only be used in the most extreme circumstances. Glenn found Commander Granite to be a professional, good-humored, and possessing a reasonable personality. It was clear to Glenn that having Granite and his 6 gunnery technicians on board would be a benefit to their mission. Granite was the descendant of a long line of Annapolis graduates. One would think, with the surname of a heavy stone, they would not be a family of naval officers, yet Granite's great-great-great-great-grandfather sailed aboard the USS Boston as part of Commodore Dewey's Asiatic Squadron in the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. Granite's great-great-great-grandfather served as an ensign aboard a destroyer escort in the First World War, protecting convoys across the Atlantic against German U-boat wolf packs. In the Second World War, Granite's great-grandfather was a lieutenant junior grade on board a submarine patrolling Japanese shipping lanes in the Pacific. He later served as a destroyer captain during the Cuban Missile Crisis blockade. Granite's grandfather served as a naval intelligence officer in the Pentagon during the War on Terror and was instrumental in the deployment of the first ship-based attack drones. Granite's father also started his career in the Maritime Navy, but was the first of his family to leave the Navy for the newly developed Space Force. Granite's father was actually the admiral that was presently overlooking the construction and deployment of the Earth's new interstellar battle fleet. Admiral Granite, as the captain, worked on the construction of the survey ship EIS Hawking. One other thing that Glenn found interesting about Granite was he didn't look at all like a man named Granite or a military man at all. If anything, he looked like the kid in the playground that would get saved from bullies by someone else named Granite. With such a family name, one would expect the commander to have a rock-hard muscular body with a well-chiseled face and strong square jawline. Instead, Granite looked more like a geek. He had a thin frame and weak chin, resembling a turtle out of his shell than a hard stone. The commander, though, was actually a typical modern military officer. In the modern military, being savvy in technology was much more instrumental than any athletic attributes. Granite was trained in Houston at the Stellar Military Academy, but he also held master's degrees in physics and computer engineering from the University of Texas in Austin. If the government had not forced Granite on him, Glenn would have made the effort to lure him out of military service to join the Polo's crew. The military also assigned the Polo a Captain Thomas Mahan, who commanded a squad of Fleet Marines. Along with the 12 Marines under his command were Sergeant Major Bryce, 2 specialists in linguistics and intelligence, and 4 Level 3 Marine Tech Sergeants. The Marines were all trained in zero-G combat and would be responsible for ship's security. They also had an additional role in the maintenance, deployment, and operations of a squad of combat robots for any surface engagement the mission may run into. Low-profiled, the combat robots were 6-legged, all-terrain platforms. They were each equipped with 5mm railguns and 24 midget smart missiles. Just one of the Rupel autonomous combat all-terrain robot had the firepower of an entire squadron of early 21st century main battle tanks. The Rackers were equipped with an array of sensors: infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray, and visual light cameras, along with sound receivers, chemical sensors, passive radar. They were also equipped with communication system to link them with ship's command, all other Racker units, and 2 supportive flying drones. This gave the Rackers amazing real-time near-fogless understanding of the theater of operation. Their understanding of the battlefield was what generals of the past could only dream of. In order to distinguish friend from foe and non-combatants, they were all equipped with the latest Gilbert AI 4D processors. The Rackers were not only capable of calculating, in motion, and complex targeting acquisitions. More importantly, their advanced artificial intelligence enabled them to make high-level tactical and moral decisions in a chaotic battlefield. Glenn personally knew Ruppel and was well aware of his development of the Rackers. If they did need to make a rescue attempt on the Shingni's home world of the Venture's crew, the Rackers would give them the much-needed force to do so. He knew that the Shingnis lagged far behind the Earth in robotic military technologies. Their military class, purely because of face, never would consent to being replaced by machines. The next day, the diplomatic team from the State Department arrived with Glenn's needed system exit visa. Much to Glenn's dismay, the State Department ignored his one request. Ms. Rebecca Stern headed the diplomatic team. The Vice Minister of the State Department's explanation was that she was the most qualified Shingnis expert they had. Glenn knew that was bull. She had never had any direct contact with the Shingnis, could not speak the language, and was only appointed as a political favor to her father, who was a major political contributor to the present administration. The only expertise she had was the reading of the logs of the EIS Hawking. Glenn was not impressed by this, since among school children that did have interest in deep space exploration, all knew the logs by heart. 2 movies had already been made based on the Hawking's first contact with the Shingnis. The movies educated the majority of the Earth's population that no longer read. There was even an animation series and comic ebooks based on the logs. Glenn, knowing Rebecca Stern, knew that she was most likely unable to distinguish between the actual facts from the original logs with the myths generated by the world's entertainment industry. Once the weapon systems were completely installed, the Marco Polo was ready for departure. They launched 3 days ahead of schedule. It was a remarkable feat, especially with all the bureaucratic hurdles that had been constructed before them. It was clear to Glenn and Landru that there were elements in the administration that clearly did not want the Marco Polo launching before the battle fleet was completed. Glenn could only hypothesize why there were elements in the present administration wishing to prevent the launch of the Marco Polo. One theory was that the Minister of State feared Glenn could resolve the present division between the Chinese and Earth, where she could not. Landru's theory was that the President's political chief of state feared that Glenn could become a possible political opponent in the next presidential election if the Polo's mission was a success. Glenn's other theory was there were elements in the military establishment that did not want the conflict resolved before they had the opportunity to play with their brand new battle fleet that was still under construction. As much as Glenn hated having Rebecca Stern on board the Polo, he could not help but acknowledge that her desire to be on this mission had given her politically connected father the incentive to remove the more serious obstacles placed before them. The president may be the president, but without Stanley Stern, he would not be sitting in the Blue Marble office. Stanley Stern was the son of a former Disney CEO. As a young man, Stern decided to start his own information company, The Vine. With his father's money and connections, he began selling inside information of the World Trade Organization to the decision-makers of international corporations and to those wishing to become major international players. The Vine later branched out into other international political organizations. He turned the Vine into a 24-hour news network, broadcasting in 8 different languages. It was the Vine that first informed its subscribers of the development of the new international centralized government. The formation of the EGG marked the end of the increasingly corrupt and impotent United Nations and unified the world under one government. Passports, for example, became relics of the past. The EGG was constructed much like the American federal government, and each nation became a mere state in the new world government. European nations and the democracies of the Pacific Rim supported its representative system of government and the end of the veto powers of World War II victors on the United Nations Security Council. Each nation received 2 representatives in the EGG Senate, no matter how large, rich, or powerful their nation was. China and India supported the formation of the EGG for the fact that the EGG's Forum of People's Representatives was based on the population of a nation. The larger their populations, the larger their number of representatives in the forum they would have. The Americans and other more libertarian and socially liberal democratic nations supported the EGG because it was a constitutional republic with written in stone guaranteed constitutional rights that were enormously difficult to amend. The EGG was not a democracy. It was a constitutional republic. The guaranteed constitutional rights did not only ensure basic living standards for all its citizens. It more importantly placed limitations on the powers of the government to ensure the rights of not only the common person, but also to ensure the rights of the uncommon person. The Constitution was designed to prevent the tyranny of a clique of powerful elites, but just as important, to prevent the tyranny of mob rule. Nations like North Korea, still dominated by the Kim dynasty, opposed the EGG due to the limits it placed on the powers of the state and the guaranteed rights it assured all its citizens. Extreme fundamentalist Muslim nations like Iran, Pakistan, and some of the Arab nations opposed the EGG due to the guarantees for religious freedom, freedom of the media, freedom of speech, and the protected rights of homosexuals and women. The greatest catalyst for change in human history has often been wars. World War III was no different. Most of the war was fought in the resource-rich continents of South America and Africa. The subcontinent was the other large theater of war as India took the combined onslaught of Pakistan and Communist China. America's default of its debt in 2020 reduced its standing. It was no longer the world's superpower, a standing it had enjoyed alone ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. America's decline emboldened Communist China to take a much more aggressive stance to force its claims of the rich resources of the South China Sea and islands in the East China Sea held by Japan, islands that had never been occupied by the Chinese. America might have kept the Chinese at bay. The nations that coastlines were awash with the waters of the South China Sea instead turned to the economically raising nation of India as their new protector. 60 million had died during the course of World War II, yet the world's population still increased during that conflict. Yet during World War III, For the first time since the Black Death of the 14th century, the world's population actually suffered a massive decrease. Africa alone lost over 700 million, South America 200 million, China 600 million from India's counterattacks with aid from a recently nuclear-armed Japan and South Korea, and the association of southeastern nations. India at the outset of the war took the greatest blunt of the opening salvos when Pakistan and China made first-strike nuclear attacks. India, for a single nation, took the greatest loss of over 800 million people by the end of the conflict. Most were lost in the first days of the war. Her losses were so large that India handed back to China the mantle as the most populous nation in the world. In comparison to the losses within the developing nations, Europe escaped with losing only triple the number they lost during World War II. America once again escaped the Third Global War, losing a mere 10 million. America and Canada were two of the few nations in the world that did not have a decline in population. They both emerged from the 2-year-long war with slightly higher populations. The war was instrumental in 3 positive outcomes. One was the ghastly, yet in the long-term beneficial outcome of a massive decrease in the human population that had been causing great strains on the world's limited resources. The second great benefit was the revolutionary technological advances made by America, European Union, Japan, and Taiwan in robotics. The third great advantage was weakening of the Chinese Communist Party. If it were not for the fall of the Chinese Communist Party after the Third World War, the chances were that China too would have not joined the EGG for the same reasons as North Korea. The end of the Communist Party led to the independence of Tibet and the Uyghurs from Chinese domination. The ousting of the Chinese Communist Party also brought about the long-awaited reunification of Taiwan with the newly democratic mainland. The newly formed United Republic of China was an instrumental force in the formation of the EGG. Glenn respected Stanley Stern for his influential guidance in the formation of the EGG. As imperfect as it was, Glenn had to admit it was a superior system to the former nation-state system. It was as much an improvement in government as the national political system was to the former provincial political systems of principalities and city-states. Glenn, though, always had issues with authority figures. He never appreciated being micromanaged, regulated, restricted, or required to jump through man-made hoops to accomplish what he wanted to achieve. He understood the need of government. He just never wanted to be governed himself by others. At least Stanley Stern and his other founding fathers of the EGG did try to create a more perfect political system. It gave the people of the world the highest standard of living in human history with the greatest number of rights, liberties, and privileges. When Stanley Stern created the Vine, he was only in his early 40s. In his 70s, he used the influence of the Vine to help spur on the creation of the EGG. Now, at 108, Stern was finally entering his golden years, and Rebecca was his youngest little princess. Her mother was a fashion model before she became Stanley Stern's 10th wife. His 65 years younger wife gave birth to Rebecca when he was 85 years old. Rebecca was his first and only girl. Stanley Stern's only son was from his 4th marriage, John Stern. John was now the CEO of the Vine and had married a male model, never giving his father grandchildren. Most of Stanley Stern's marriages never lasted long, simply because he never married for love, but for lust, and the younger and younger women he married never married for love either. They married for his extreme wealth. Money was no longer necessary to live a comfortable life, but with money, one could live a much grander lifestyle, a lifestyle that most in the general public could never even imagine. Those with money could afford to see the rings of Saturn or the red spot of Jupiter in person on board an interplanetary luxury cruise liner. Those with money could gamble in the finest casinos and resorts around the world. Those with money could build personal collections of artworks, antiques, and items of historical significance. Most importantly, much like any other time in history, those with money could influence those in government to give them political favors to guarantee they would continue to make even more money. Administrated by the EGG, the robotic and cold fusion revolutions completely pacified the masses with free housing, free food, free entertainment, free medical, free transportation, and free education. The standard of living of an unemployed citizen of the late 21st century was higher than that of their grandparents, whom had to slave away in office cubicles day after day, month after month, and year after year. Born into Uberwealth, Rebecca Stern saw the rings of Saturn aboard a Dorfman luxury liner when she was only 8 years old. At 10, she had a museum collection of mid-20th century Barbie dolls. By the age of 13, she received her first 100,000 credit diamond bracelet. For her sweet 16th birthday, her father bought her own fusion-powered Skunk Works flying car. At 18, she had her own estate on Long Island Sound's Gold Coast. Rebecca did not only inherit her father's money, she also luckily inherited her mother's looks. Rebecca was an extremely beautiful woman, with shapely long legs, a slender, shapely body many other women would pay surgery for. Her light milk chocolate skin was smooth and blemish-free. Her flowing hair seemed spun from the finest black silk. Her full sensual mouth was only outshined by her large brown Bambi-like eyes. Stanley Stern always joked that his daughter had inherited her eyes from her Disney CEO grandfather. She was a magnet of beauty to the shallow, and the children of parents who wanted to earn favors from her father. Everything came easy for Rebecca Stern. Too easy. The fact that Glenn never kowtowed to her natural physical beauty, or the fact she was Stanley Stern's little princess, outraged Ms. Stern to no end. His inability to be a yes-man to everything she would say was also a major thorn in their relationship. Like most stubborn people who are used to always getting their way, she often accused Glenn of being the one that was stubborn and impossible to deal with. It never bothered Glenn that Rebecca Stern disagreed with him often. What really irritated him about her was her annoying whiny nasal voice. It annoyed him like the uncomfortable chills many would feel with the sound of scratching on a blackboard. Her constant nagging was as annoying as the yips of a small yip dog. What really got under Glenn's skin was her privileged, unjustified air of superiority and spoiled personality that made her feel she was entitled to whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. The few times he had encountered her, she brought him often to the verge of wanting to slap her, just to shut her up. It took all his mental strength to resist the temptation. He found it a miracle that when he was around her, he was able to remain the gentleman his father and grandfather had always instilled in him to be. They had often told him that there was never a reason for a real man to ever strike a woman. His only hope was that the Marco Polo was large enough to allow him to avoid Rebecca Stern as much as possible on their 20 or more day journey through deep space.